Story 1. My husband and I have been together for 10 years now, and our lives have changed a lot in that time. There have been many good moments in our marriage: travel, evenings together, joys and small victories. But in the last few years, shadows have appeared more and more often that we could not drive away. Our closeness, once natural and sincere, began to gradually disappear, like fog dissipating in the rays of the morning sun. I remember the moment when I realized something was wrong. It wasn't a flashy event, a big scandal, or an obvious betrayal. It all happened slowly, like a falling stone that doesn't immediately break the surface of the water, but soon begins to create ripples that spread further and further. In our case, these ripples were in the relationship, which couldn't be masked by any words. Every time we tried to solve our problems, we found ourselves in a vicious cycle. We went to couples therapists, naively hoping that help from an expert would show us the right path. We saw several, and each time it began with the hope that we would finally figure out where exactly the disagreement had occurred. But each time, I left those sessions feeling like I wasn't getting what I needed. My husband always claimed that counselors didn't understand us, that they always took one of our sides, usually mine, and didn't give us the right tools to fix the situation. He claimed that we could solve everything ourselves, that we simply didn't need outside help. I couldn't help but notice that this was more of an excuse than a real desire to solve the problem. At its core, he didn't want to change. He didn't want to work on himself, on the things that were bothering me. It was obvious, but I still tried to believe that he really wanted to improve our relationship. The last time we went to a therapist was about a year ago. That session was particularly difficult. We sat in the office, and I felt a wave of helplessness wash over me. Every time my husband and I tried to talk, his accusations became more and more harsh, and his certainty that he was right left me no chance to be heard. I tried to explain my feelings, my experiences, but he looked at me as if I were his enemy. The psychologist could not help because the man did not want to listen, did not want to change. After a while, I noticed that his attitude towards therapists was becoming more and more cynical. He often said that they couldn't help us because they were too committed. He claimed that I was the one who needed to be fixed, and he was just trying to endure this ordeal. And me, I kept trying to believe that we had a chance. I tried to be strong because I didn't want my son to grow up in a family where his parents were getting divorced. I knew I had to fight, but I was almost out of strength. But the moment I found out about his work wife, everything changed. I can't say that I immediately felt something was wrong. Everything was as usual. Days full of work and household chores. Evenings when we were both tired and each of us retreated into our own world. He immersed himself in video games. I read books. We continued to live together, but we became increasingly distant from each other. But something had been bothering me lately. I began to notice how he was becoming more withdrawn, how he kept mentioning his colleague, a woman with whom he often communicated at work, more and more often. I couldn't figure out what exactly was bothering me. At first, it was something elusive, like a shadow flickering in the corner of his eye. But then I began to feel that something was wrong. Maybe it was his endless stories about her opinions on work or his passionate discussions of her ideas, but I began to sense that there was something more between them than just friendship. When I stumbled across their correspondence, I felt something break inside me. I can't say exactly what it was about that correspondence that struck me so. Maybe it was her relentless meddling in our personal affairs. Maybe it was the moment I realized that all those intimate moments we had shared were being discussed with someone who was a stranger to me. I felt myself being burned by betrayal. It wasn't just a discussion about work. It was much worse. He told her about our fights, about how I felt with him, about how we couldn't find a way to each other. He even shared with her intimate details of our sex life, our problems and experiences. And she used all this to judge me and convince him that all these were my problems, that he was actually absolutely right in his decisions, and I just didn't understand. When I first came face to face with this reality, it hurt. It was a pain that wouldn't go away. It would come back to me every time I thought about it. I felt myself being torn apart by an internal conflict. I knew he would never admit that this was more than just a friendly support, but I also knew that I couldn't continue as I had been. And now as I sat alone again, processing everything that had happened, I found it hard to imagine what would happen next. I wondered if it could be fixed, and if so, how. I still loved him, despite everything that had happened, but I didn't know if I could ever trust him again. I felt like I was losing myself in this marriage, like I was becoming a shadow of the woman I once was. It had been months since I had learned the truth about his interactions with his work wife. We lived under the same roof, but our worlds had become completely different. Every day felt like a fight to maintain the appearance of normalcy, but inside there was an emptiness that I couldn't fill with anything. I stopped looking for common topics of conversation. Everything seemed empty and meaningless. All I wanted was peace and some time to sort myself out, but there was no such time in this house. He continued to live his life, and I lived mine. We did not argue, but we did not communicate. We did not live as a couple. Evenings became hours when each of us went to his own room and did his own thing. He continued to spend hours playing video games. Sometimes I heard his laughter or conversations with friends, but these were sounds that had nothing to do with me. I immersed myself in books. I read novels until late at night, trying to immerse myself in other worlds, to forget what was happening in my life. Every now and then I caught myself thinking that somehow everything used to be different. We used to look forward to the evenings when we would just sit next to each other, laugh, and discuss the day. Where is all that? Where are those moments when we could just be ourselves, when everything seemed simple and clear? I couldn't understand why I kept staying with him. I felt a growing sense of betrayal and emptiness wash over me. Why couldn't I just walk away? Why did I keep fighting for this marriage that wasn't what we had once built together? Why was it so hard to let him go? I decided that something needed to change. And the first thing I started with was trying to build my own space. I began to devote more time to myself, my interests and activities. Sometimes I walked alone, went to a cafe, just spent time alone with myself. This helped me regain my strength a little, but at the same time, I still felt that something was missing. At some point, I noticed that he started talking about his feelings more often. He told me that he, too, lacked intimacy. He said that despite everything that had happened, he was still worried about our marriage and could not understand what I wanted from him. He said that he was drawn to me, but he did not know how to fix everything. He could not understand why I did not give him a second chance. But this upset me more than it calmed me. His words sounded empty, like an echo. I could not believe in their sincerity. All these conversations looked like an attempt to justify himself, nothing more. I'm telling you that I still love you, he said. But what should I say? How can I believe these words when they were spoken by the same man who could so easily entrust my life and feelings to another woman? Discuss with her the details of our marriage, our personal moments. How can I believe that he is sincere? I tried not to think about it. I tried to close my eyes to it, because if I kept digging, I'd soon find myself at the bottom, where there would be no answers except pain. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that even if I wanted to forgive him, what for? To live in constant fear that it would happen again someday? To live with this doubt that I wasn't important? At some point, I realized that I simply couldn't continue living the way I had before. We had both become strangers. His empty silence and my constant thoughts about it were becoming unbearable. I knew I had to decide something. I had a child, and although I still loved my husband, I couldn't stay in a state where every day was burdened with disappointment. I tried to talk to him, but every time I brought up how hurt I was, he seemed more distant. He promised that things would change, but every time I tried to make a move, he retreated into his own world. I realized that perhaps he didn't understand the gravity of the situation. His feelings for his work wife might have been innocent from his point of view, but for me it was something much more. I couldn't turn a blind eye to the fact that our intimate moments had become a topic of discussion with her, and that he allowed her to interfere in our personal lives at all. But at the same time, I knew it wasn't just his mistake, it was ours. We both lost, but if I didn't make a decision, it would go on forever. I couldn't just wait for him to get it and start changing. I couldn't waste years trying to save something that had long since lost its value. I felt like I needed to do something. But what? How do you restore trust when it's already broken? How do you restore love when it's already faded? How much longer can you fight for something that's already gone? Every day it became more and more difficult, and I understood that I needed to find the strength to make a decision. But it was scary. Scary to let go, scary to forgive, scary to move on. A few more weeks passed, but I still couldn't find the strength to make a final decision. I felt how hard it was for me to accept what had happened, and how hard it was to accept the reality that we could no longer be the people we once were. Every morning I woke up with a heavy feeling that something was wrong, but I couldn't figure out how exactly this wrong was going to be resolved. I began to notice that my perception of the world and the people around me was changing. In the evenings, I increasingly found myself thinking about how other couples lived. I thought that maybe somewhere there were those who did not worry about betrayal, who continued to be happy, even if their relationship had gone through something similar. I thought that maybe I was the one who was overreacting. Maybe I was just too demanding. Sometimes, sitting in silence, I felt this uncertainty growing. I tried to talk to him, but the conversations ended the same way as all the others. He tried to justify himself, to say that he had done nothing to make me feel betrayed, and I couldn't understand how he could be so calm. He went on with his life as if nothing had happened, and I seemed to be immersed deeper and deeper in my own thoughts, trying to figure out where I had gone wrong, where everything had gone wrong. He kept insisting that he had no feelings for that woman, that it was just a misunderstanding. But I saw something in his eyes that told me otherwise. He may not have realized how deep his affection for her ran, but that didn't make my pain any less real. Every night when I walked home from work, I felt the distance between us grow with each step. I could tell he was there, but the feeling that he was a stranger was unbearable. It wasn't just a physical distance, it was an emotional one. I couldn't comprehend how much everything had changed in the last few years. He had once been my friend, my partner, my protector, but now I couldn't believe that we could ever get everything back. When I thought about it, I couldn't understand what came first in our lives, his distancing from me or my inner pain. I stopped perceiving him as the person with whom we made plans, laughed, and dreamed. He became a symbol of unfulfilled hopes, those unspoken words and promises that were never fulfilled. We couldn't talk about what happened because every time I brought it up, he would say it was in the past. But how could I forget? How could I just let go of his words, his actions, his behavior that showed he wasn't there for me the way I needed him to be? I began to wonder if I was suffering so much, maybe I shouldn't continue this relationship. Maybe I was living in the past, hoping that things would get better, that we would go back to being the people we were when we met. I remembered how we discussed everything back then, how supportive he was, how easy it was to be around. But now it felt like I didn't know this person. He was like a shadow of the one I loved. Every time we tried to talk about our intimacy, I felt like I couldn't find the right words to convey to him how much I was hurting. He continued to do his own thing, and I felt a growing sense of loneliness pressing down on me. I trying to pretend that everything was normal. I even smiled when he suggested spending time together, but inside me there was no joy or desire. I no longer knew what I could offer except my attention, and he in turn did not know how his words could heal the wound that had formed inside me. As I sat in the kitchen cooking dinner, I could hear his footsteps in the hallway, his voice talking to someone on the phone, but it all seemed so distant. We had become strangers in our own home. I kept trying to find answers to my questions, but the answers never seemed to come. I thought about what would have happened if I had left. What would have happened if I hadn't returned to his world and tried to save our marriage? Was it too late? I tried to convince myself that I could still change my life, that I could be strong and not let myself lose myself. But the longer I stayed with him, the more I felt my own identity slipping away. A few more days passed, and I decided that I had to make a choice. I couldn't continue to live in such an emotional vacuum. I couldn't close my eyes to my feelings. I knew I had to make a decision, but which one? The one that would bring me peace, but at the same time not destroy everything completely. A week passed, and I still couldn't find an answer to my question. We lived next to each other, but it was as if we were in different worlds. I could no longer calmly look at his face or not feel the pain growing inside me. I kept thinking about what I had lost, about what could have been if everything had been different. How would my life have turned out if I had never learned about his secret friendship, if I hadn't met that look that betrayed his hidden feelings? Every night lying in bed, I tried to focus on my thoughts, but they became more and more confusing and disturbing. I closed my eyes, but his voice was still in my head. He still said those words that could not come back, could not change everything. You're exaggerating. It's not that important. I didn't cheat on you. I tried to believe it, but the more I thought about it, the more I felt like I was being deceived. I began to doubt not only him, but myself. How could I have been so blind, so naive, not to see what was happening right before my eyes? I tried to justify him. He was never perfect, and I can't say that I was always perfect either. There were moments when we both grew apart, but this betrayal, this attempt to justify myself through a stranger, through someone else's advice and views, it was beyond my strength. I couldn't understand why he couldn't just tell me about his feelings, couldn't talk to me honestly. Why couldn't he ask what was needed for both of us, and not in order to hide important moments of our lives from me? I tried to remember those moments when we were happy. We walked in the park, laughed, discussed our dreams and plans for the future. I remembered how he hugged me, how his hands reached out to me. I tried to return to that moment when we were alone, when we did not feel this cold distance that was between us now. But as always, the memories seemed so distant, so lost, and I could not hold them in my mind. As I left for work, I felt the barrier growing stronger. We barely talked about anything important. I was bottling up my feelings again because I knew that any attempt to broach the subject would only lead to more disappointment. He was so far away, but he wasn't leaving. It wasn't the physical distance. It was the invisible barrier that had arisen between us. And I thought maybe I'm just too caught up in the pain. Maybe I've been living in the past for too long and can't let go of what was. Maybe I need to look to the future, find the strength to move on. I began to notice how this process was destroying my perception of reality. I was constantly thinking about his actions, every word, every look, and all of this made me feel like I was losing control. Maybe I really am too caught up in the past, but what can can I do if it continues to haunt me? In those moments, I wondered if this relationship was worth staying in for what could have been. And if it was, how could I restore what had been broken? I wanted to believe that it could still be fixed, that we could go back to the good days that used to be. But with each passing day, I realized more and more that it wasn't that easy. I felt like I was lacking support. When we were silent, I sought solace in books, but that didn't help either. I read novels, immersed myself in fictional worlds, but I couldn't find the ease and simplicity that I once felt in real life. I was just trying to distract myself from reality so as not to think about what was happening between us. One evening, after I returned home, the house seemed even emptier. He was sitting on the couch as usual, absorbed in the TV screen, and I was sitting opposite him, feeling the silence growing between us. He didn't speak, didn't offer anything, as if I were part of this empty space and not the person with whom he had once shared dreams. I felt that this silence could be not only the end, but also a new beginning. Maybe it was the silence that gave me the opportunity to think about what I wanted. I could no longer be the woman who waited for everything to change on its own. I realized that I had to take a step, make a choice, even though this choice was scary. I had to decide if I could continue to love him or if it was time to let him go. And if I decided to let him go, how would I live with that decision? We had been a part of each other's lives for so long that the thought of breaking up seemed impossible. But something inside me was telling me it was time to start living for real, not just existing. I didn't know what to do. I was becoming more and more doubtful every day, and these thoughts became the ones that tormented me. Maybe I wasn't ready to leave everything behind, but maybe this was how I could find myself again. I woke up early in the morning, before the first rays of sunlight had penetrated the windows. Everything was silent, even his breathing, which as always accompanied my awakening. I lay motionless, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand why there was no peace or clarity in my soul. Something inside me was turning over restlessly, as if I was waiting for an answer that I could not find. All I knew was that I could no longer continue as before. It was as if he and I were together, but we did not feel each other. I tried to talk to him about what was going on in our lives, but every time I did, he either withdrew or became defensive, defending his actions. My words, my feelings, became foreign to him, something he couldn't or wouldn't deal with. I felt like his words were casting me into the shadows, as if I was no longer the woman who had once been important to him. That day, when I took the initiative again and tried to talk to him, he brushed me off again. It was like a blow. I saw his eyes sliding over me, as if he no longer noticed me. He continued to absorb his life into video games and work, but not into us. We no longer had important conversations. His gaze no longer had the warmth I once felt in it. It became clear to me that I could no longer remain in this state. I thought I needed at least some time for myself. I realized I couldn't continue without changes. I couldn't stay in a relationship that had long since ceased to bring me joy. I needed to do something to get myself back. I decided I would start with small steps. I chose a day for myself that would be dedicated only to me, regardless of what he did or said. I couldn't do this before. It was too scary, too threatening to what remained between us. But I decided it was time. I went to a cafe, sat at a table by the window and just sat there. For a long time, I couldn't decide what to do. There was so much inside me that I needed to spill out, but at the same time, I felt like I wasn't ready to share it yet. I opened my laptop and started writing. It became my way of sorting out what was going on inside. I wrote about how hard it was for me to trust after everything that had happened. I wrote about my fears, my experiences, how I was losing myself in this marriage. It wasn't easy. My thoughts were all over the place, and maybe I didn't even know what I needed. But I did know that as I sat there, alone, I felt the weight of letting go of the life I knew. I wrote about how good we had once been together and how I wanted us to go back to that. But at the same time, I felt like I couldn't go back to that state because it was based on illusions. We could no longer be the people we had been before. That evening, when I returned home, I was once again confronted with what I didn't want to see. He was there, sitting on the couch, playing a game like always and not noticing me. My steps became heavy because I felt all of this pulling me back to this painful state that I could no longer bear. I tried to talk to him again anyway, but as always, my words were useless to him. He looked at me as if I was part of his environment, but nothing more. I felt a coldness forming in my chest. It wasn't anger, just a feeling of emptiness. I couldn't bring myself to stay here any longer. In this place where there was no understanding, no support, I was just one of the parts of his life, nothing more. That night, I decided I needed to take a step forward. I needed to go somewhere new. It didn't mean I was ready to leave right away, but I felt like I needed to change something in my life. I couldn't stand the picture that had formed between us anymore. I wanted to understand what I really wanted from life, from myself. I decided that I would go to the park where we once walked, where we laughed and talked about what awaited us in the future. I remembered this moment as bright, but now it was part of the past. I needed to let it go, at least for a while, to realize what I really needed. When I got there, I felt everything around me fill with silence and peace. The wind played with the leaves, and I sat on the bench, feeling how these moments gave me the opportunity to renew my strength. I closed my eyes and just sat in silence. There, in this park, I felt real, without any pretensions and expectations. I didn't have to be perfect. I didn't have to do anything for others. I began to understand that the way forward lies through me, through what I feel and want. When I got home, I was ready. I knew the conversation would be difficult, but I knew I couldn't stay in this swamp any longer. I had to start living my own life, not be held hostage by a relationship that no longer brought me happiness. At that moment, I made a decision. I would find my way, no matter what happened next. The time for change had come, and I was ready to meet it, despite the fear. A few days had passed since I had made the decision. I still felt as if I was standing on the threshold of something new, something vast and unknown. It was like stepping into a fog, not being able to see what was ahead, but at the same time, it felt like this was the only path I needed to take. Everything changed in a single moment when I realized that I was no longer part of this dynamic, that I had freed myself from what was holding me captive. At first, it was hard to get used to the new sensations. Everything seemed a little strange, as if I had just left the old familiar world and stepped into the unknown. Every day was full of small worries. I kept catching myself thinking that something was slipping away from me, but I couldn't figure out what exactly. Maybe it was fear or just uncertainty, but something inside me told me that this was necessary. Everything that had previously seemed unshakable now turned out to be shaky and unreliable. I began to notice how I felt the space around me in a new way. Everything became brighter, more colorful. I realized with surprise that I had not seen all this beauty before, when I was absorbed in worries and experiences. The world around me continued to exist in its unchanging, majestic silence, and I suddenly felt how insignificant all those little things that I had been fixated on for so long had become. I got up in the morning and decided that I would start a new day, and this day would not be like the previous ones. I went for a run. I always liked to run, but somehow it happened that I forgot about myself in the daily routine. Now when I ran, I did not think about what someone owed me. I thought only about myself, about how my body was filled with life with every step, about how the air became fresh and clean. In this new world, I started to find myself. I tried things I had long forgotten. I started reading books I had left on the shelf. I picked up my old camera again and started to photograph the world around me, to capture every moment. These simple things seemed so meaningful. Every morning I woke up with a slight feeling that something was changing. I started to see my inner world filling with new colors, and it was incredible. I kept trying to figure out what it was that had pulled me out of that quagmire. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that there wasn't one specific event. It was more like a combination of many small moments. I couldn't be the woman who lived in anticipation anymore, including the expectation that he would suddenly change. I no longer placed my hopes and dreams on him. I saw that I had the strength inside me to move on, and it didn't depend on him. I realized that I could be happy without his presence, without his approval. This new path I chose was long and difficult. I often faced doubts. Sometimes I was overwhelmed by a feeling of loneliness, and I couldn't help but think how much time I had wasted. But I knew it was the right decision. I could move forward even if I had to move alone. I was no longer afraid of being alone. I realized that this was not the end, but a new start. Sometimes I wished he could understand how I felt, but I didn't seek his understanding anymore. I had learned to accept myself, and that was what mattered most. I could move on, to seek new horizons without feeling afraid. I knew that the further I got away from all of this, the easier it would be to breathe deeply. A few weeks passed, and I felt not only my life changing, but my perspective on it. I became stronger, not in the sense that I learned to fight every obstacle, but in the sense that I stopped being afraid of change. I learned to let go. I learned to let go not only of him, but also of my attachment to how my relationship was supposed to work. I no longer questioned my actions. I no longer asked myself if I had done the right thing. I no longer got lost in uncertainty. I just went. Sometimes I found myself thinking that I was taking steps along a path that was not yet in sight. Sometimes I wanted to look back to see what would happen next, but I believed more and more that there would be be something better ahead, that there would be a world in which I could be myself, in which I would not fight what was impossible to change. And despite everything that had happened, I felt that I did not need to look back. It was all part of this path. I didn't know where this new path would lead me, but I wasn't afraid of it anymore. What mattered to me now was not where I was going, but that I had finally chosen to go, and I felt it filling me with light. A few months passed, and I began to realize how much had changed inside me. I increasingly accepted myself as I was, without unnecessary excuses and attempts to please someone. Being honest with myself became more important than being right in someone's eyes. I was not in a hurry. I did not strive for quick results, but it became clear to me that this was my real liberation. Every day I woke up and felt like I was being reborn. I woke up feeling light, without the weight on my soul. It was unusual to live with guilt and doubt for so long, and then let it go, to feel like I could breathe, not depend on other people's decisions. I learned to let go of resentments, fears, and my own attachment to how things should have turned out. It was not easy, but I did it. I realized that for so long I had been fighting against things I couldn't change. I was trying to control things that weren't mine, looking for answers where there weren't any, but the truth was that freedom only came when I accepted that there was no point in holding on to the old. The idea that we could go back to the old way began to fade as I learned to let go. I knew now I couldn't change him, but I could change myself, and that was enough. My view on relationships has changed too. I have come to realize that not everything has to be about fighting and trying to hold on to something. I have long understood that I cannot control another person, and that love is not always about being willing to do everything for someone. Love is the ability to support yourself even when the world around you is falling apart. And despite everything that has happened, I have truly learned to love myself. This was a completely new experience for me. I found myself asking myself more and more, what next? What kind of life awaits me ahead? Last year, I wouldn't have been able to answer this question with certainty, but now I knew that what was important to me was not what had happened, but what I was doing with it now. I could choose how to move forward, what steps to take. And although fear still sometimes crept up, I felt confidence growing inside me. One day I went for a walk again. I passed the old park that we used to visit so often. Everything was so familiar and yet so strange. I stopped to look at the empty swings that had once been filled with laughter. Now they stood in the shade of the trees, alone. There was no bitterness in my soul, no regrets. I knew that I had found this path that led me to myself. I was not trying to bring back the old. It was just a part of my life, but not its foundation. I no longer regretted the time I had lost. Sometimes we go through years clinging to something that doesn't bring us joy, trying to hold on to something that should have gone away a long time ago. But when you let go of that, you realize how much easier life becomes. And when I left all that behind, I realized that there was room for joy in my life again. I could look to the future with optimism, and that was something new. I found people I could talk to, share my thoughts with, and not be judged. I began to rebuild my life, and although the path was not straight, I no longer felt lost. I increasingly found answers within myself, not in the opinions of others. Every day I felt more and more like I was regaining my strength, like I was becoming whole again. What was important for me was that I stopped looking for external support because I realized that my strength had always been inside me. It was a discovery that could not be overestimated. I learned to live not for someone else, but for myself. This was my path, my choice. At times I remembered him, remembered moments that once seemed important, but now I understood that they were not. I did not hold on to illusions, and this gave me the strength to move on. My new path is the path of acceptance. I accepted my life as it is. I accepted it with all its mistakes and failures, but at the same time with each step forward. I accepted my decisions that once seemed difficult. I accepted my independence and the strength that was born from pain. Now I could look into the future with a clear gaze. I didn't know what was ahead, but I wasn't afraid anymore. This was my life, and I was choosing it. Story 2. I always considered myself a risk taker, but ever since she came into my life, I've been questioning my understanding of that phrase. We started where we shouldn't have started. I knew she was married. I knew her relationship with her husband was on the rocks, but she was still his wife, and yet that didn't stop us from meeting. I couldn't control what I felt when she was around, and I saw in her eyes what I didn't see in other women's eyes. Genuine interest and some kind of indescribable warmth that immediately made me feel like everything that happened between us mattered. In the beginning, our meetings were rare, random, and full of passion. It was a kind of game, but a game in which I did not know how it would end. We both hid it from those around us. She from her husband, I from my friends, from my life. But the more we met, the stronger the attraction became. I could not understand what it was. Love, passion, or just the desire to have her in my life, despite the fact that it was impossible. Every time we were alone, I forgot more and more that she was married. I saw only her touches, her look, which made me understand that I was the one who could make her forget about everything. And this attracted me even more. I was ready to hide from the whole world to be near her, despite the fact that I was perfectly aware that she was not free. But her life, like mine, was not so simple. My husband already knew that something was wrong. He sensed something, and this knowledge, as I later understood, pushed her to a decision that changed everything. She left him, leaving behind a broken relationship. It was her decision, her step forward, and I frankly did not even think about the consequences. She was there, and that was enough. I had no doubt that we could be happy together. It all seemed like the beginning of something big and important. We moved into a new apartment, moved in together right away. She didn't regret her decision. I, with each passing day, felt more and more how this situation began to change, but not in the direction I expected. At first, we felt like teenagers who had just started their first experience in a relationship. Everything was new, but at the same time, there was too much that we didn't realize. I thought that it was enough to be happy, just being together and enjoying the moment. But, as expected, the passion began to fade. At first, it was subtle, little signals that I didn't want to notice. The look she used to give me every time we met became less frequent. She began to seek out my company less, and I, in turn, began to feel that her affection was no longer what it used to be. I tried to do more for her, to find new ways to cheer her up, but with each passing day it became more and more difficult. I realized that this routine no longer brought the same pleasure as before. We started talking less. When she was around, I felt how much I needed something new. I tried to talk openly about how I needed more space and independence. I was looking for a partner who could be emotionally stable, who would not require constant care. But my words were not always perceived the way I wanted. She tried to avoid conflicts to please me, as if this was the only way she could keep me. Every conversation became more and more meaningless, and I lost confidence in my ability to change anything. I felt myself becoming more and more tired as each day became a day where I had to remind myself again that it still made sense. And even though I tried so hard to understand her, I couldn't feel what we once had. We became friends without a spark, and every time I tried to find a way to get it back, it only led to me feeling more frustrated. My thoughts began to return more and more often to the time when I was her lover, when we were just starting out. There was something alive, passionate then, which was now inaccessible. Every day this thought tormented me more and more. I could not get rid of the feeling that that passion had gone away with the time we began living together. And then one day when I was starting to feel like I was on the verge of us not being happy anymore, I met her, that colleague. She was my age, and there was some strange attraction between us. We started texting, exchanging views and ideas, and I couldn't help but notice that there was an interest in her eyes that I hadn't felt for a long time. I knew it wasn't something serious, but I enjoyed talking to her, and she became something new, something that caught my attention. I began torn between two worlds. One was familiar, worn out, but comfortable. The other was new, exciting, but questionable. And so I found myself on the edge. Should I try to get the relationship back or let it go and meet something new? With each passing day, the thought that I could find something more became more and more urgent. The colleague I was corresponding with was not something planned or long awaited. She was just a woman I found interesting to talk to. There was something light and casual in our conversations, as if we understood each other without words. I never expected that the correspondence that began as friendly and meaningless would lead me to such thoughts. I began to notice how often our conversations became the main reason for me to smile throughout the day. I couldn't remember the last time I felt something like this while sitting with my girlfriend. With each message, I felt myself moving away from the routine that I was finding increasingly oppressive. Our conversations with my colleague were engaging, and I could relax, be myself, without the fear that she would judge me for every choice, every word. It was like returning to some carefree days. We discussed everything from work to personal issues, but most importantly, I saw my outlook on life and relationships begin to change a little. She didn't demand anything specific from me, didn't ask for proof of my interest. I could just be myself, and it turned out to mean more to me than I could have ever imagined. It was refreshing. I began to notice that I was worrying much less than usual, and I felt more and more free each day. One day, I casually told myself that maybe I would date her at some point if she asked me. It was a strange feeling that I immediately tried to suppress. There was a voice in my head that reminded me that I couldn't do that. I was in a relationship, and there was too much invested in it to just up and end it. But despite these thoughts, the feeling of attraction continued to grow. I didn't know what it was about her that attracted me. It wasn't just physical attraction. I couldn't say that I wanted her just to replace my girlfriend. It was something more complex. She gave me a sense of newness, some uncharted territory that I hadn't dared to tread in my normal life. I felt like she was a mirror in which I could see a part of myself that had been missing for a long time, a part that was missing from the relationship. But at the same time, I knew it was all just hypothetical. I was with a girl I'd been living with for over a year now, and even though our relationship had become routine, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all for a reason. I'd been trying to find a way to get those old emotions back for a long time, and I didn't want to give up without trying again. After all, I was sure that if I couldn't do that, then maybe the relationship had really run its course. But how can you be sure of that decision when you haven't tried to change anything? As I sat at my desk, scrolling through my messages with a colleague, I felt an internal conflict tearing through me. She was distant, like everyone else, but there was something in her words, in her questions, in the looks I read between the lines that drew me in more than any rational argument. I began to realize that these messages had become my own little secret world, where I could be away I hadn't been with anyone in a long time, and it was both scary and refreshing. At some point, I realized that I didn't really need any physical intimacy with her to feel like she was important in my life. I could just discuss anything with her, and it would evoke emotions in me that I hadn't felt in a long time. It was just communication, but so deep and real that I began to doubt myself. Every day I felt more and more torn between being faithful to my girlfriend, with whom I shared memories, stories, plans for the future, and allowing myself to be with someone who gave me the emotions I was missing so much. I tried to be honest with myself, but it seemed the more I tried to figure out my feelings, the less I understood what I really wanted. Every day I increasingly caught myself thinking that I was losing touch with reality, that I could no longer distinguish where my relationship with my girlfriend ended and something new, uncertain, and unjustified began. But even then I was overtaken by the thought, how can I understand that this is not just a desire for new emotions, but really what I lack in life? Or maybe I just missed that feeling when everything was new and unpredictable. This moment seemed to be the one when I had to decide what to do with what had accumulated inside me. Did I want to break off the familiar relationship that had become increasingly dull, or should I fight for it once more, hoping for the return of old feelings? But how could I understand if I was already reaching for something else that stood on the other end of this emotional bridge? Several days passed, but I still couldn't shake the thought that my feelings for my colleague had become something more than just sympathy. It was incomprehensible, almost alarming. I couldn't help but notice how easily I became dependent on communicating with her. Every time I opened my phone, my gaze involuntarily slid over her name in the list of messages. All this correspondence seemed like some kind of comfort zone to which I was happy to return, despite the fact that I understood this was a path that led to a dead end. With each new message with a colleague, I felt like a person who holds two worlds in his hands and can't decide which one really belongs to him. I had a girl in my life with whom I lived for a year and a half, but now it seemed to me that I was unable to understand why this relationship was not developing, why I did not feel what I wanted to feel. When I started communicating with a colleague, something changed, but what exactly? I had this conflicting question inside me. Do I want to keep my relationship for the sake of stability and my comfort zone? Or should I let myself go and look for something else that suits me better? I tried to analyze why I started to reach out to someone else. Was it just my desires? Or was I looking for an outlet to avoid the realization that my relationship was no longer satisfying me, that I was no longer the same person my girlfriend once dated? With each passing day, with each new conversation with my colleague, I increasingly began to doubt that my relationship with the girl still had a future. We talked to each other, but it was no longer what it had been before. I felt the fire that had burned between us fading. It had nothing to do with her character or shortcomings. It was more about us, about how we had changed during the time we spent together. My girlfriend was increasingly trying to please me, and this attempt to avoid conflicts, to always be in the role of an obedient partner, only strengthened my feelings that I had no opportunity to be equal with her. She did not challenge me. She was not someone with whom I would like to build something deeper and more meaningful. I tried to find answers to all these questions. I thought that maybe I was just bored because our life had become routine and the relationship was something that did not bring the excitement that I once felt. But maybe I was afraid of change. Maybe I was afraid that the final decision I made would change everything and lead to consequences that I would have a hard time surviving. Correspondence with my colleague brought me joy, but also a feeling of guilt. I tried to justify myself by saying that it was all insignificant, that these were just words that had no basis in reality. But I knew that was not so. I felt myself gradually beginning to dissolve in these conversations, to find in them some comforting truth that hid my real doubts. And so, at some point, I realized that I couldn't continue like this. I had to decide what exactly I wanted from my relationship. Should I try to recreate the feelings we once had? And if not, then what next? Could we go back to what was before, or was it all gone forever? With this question in my mind, I decided to talk to her. I needed to understand what would happen to our relationship. Could it be saved, or was I already too far gone to get back something that had seemed so important before? I couldn't live in this limbo, in this state between two worlds. But at the same time, I was afraid that any decision I made would be my last step. What if this really was the end? In parallel with these thoughts, I continued to write to my colleague, although every time I went into the messenger and saw her name, I felt a small pang of conscience. I didn't want to let her down, because even though I felt attracted to her, I didn't want to deceive her. I wasn't sure that my feelings for her were something that could grow into something more. I didn't know if I wanted this, or if I was simply looking for a new interest in life that would remind me that I was still alive, that I could still experience some emotions. And so I found myself faced with a choice that I could not put off until later. More and more often, I found myself living between two worlds. On the one hand, my girlfriend, with whom I spent 1.5 years and with whom I had my own story. On the other hand, a colleague, with whom everything started out easy and without obligations, but now became much more than just a colleague. Emotions were becoming more and more confusing, and I didn't know how to separate them, how to understand what I was really feeling. One evening, after yet another correspondence with a colleague, I felt reality begin to distort. I was sitting in our apartment, familiar and cozy, but everything looked somehow different from before. Everything seemed too familiar, too boring. I could not get rid of the feeling that I was deceiving myself with something and someone. My gaze darted around the room, trying to find a point of support, but in my head there was only chaos. I began to look for something in this place that could bring back the old feelings, but I found nothing. Life with the girl with whom we became a couple right after her divorce no longer brought joy. We became like two people who live next to each other, but do not feel each other. She continued to be the same as always, kind, attentive, ready to help. But all this seemed too predictable to me. I felt how the spark that once burned between us was disappearing. And if before I could not think about it, now it became obvious. Something was wrong. And I knew that the problem was in me, but it was difficult for me to accept it. It was uncomfortable to admit to myself that I did not want to be with this person with whom I once built a future. But still, I could not force myself to experience this feeling, not knowing what to do next. Whenever I thought back to the correspondence with my colleague, I felt a sense of disappointment wash over me. We had communicated easily, interestingly, but this interest was not the same as the one I had once felt for a girl. It was a different kind of involvement, almost invisible, but felt at every step. Everything was becoming clearer. What I liked in communicating with my colleague was not just external, but hidden from me by myself. I was looking for new excitement, looking for excitement that would make my heart beat faster. Because if I were honest with myself, I would understand that the boredom that had taken over my life had become my greatest enemy. And now this feeling had simply grown into something more. This was more than just routine. It was a complete distortion of what I had once felt to be the norm. But I couldn't stop. Whenever I started to think that maybe I could try to work on my relationship with the girl again, I wanted to get back to this new dynamic where I didn't feel like I had to be someone to someone. There was no pressure in texting with a coworker. There were no tedious conversations about problems and complaints. We talked about simple things, about how our day went, about the movies we saw. It was new, it was fresh, and it was what I wanted. It was painful for me to admit to myself that I didn't feel the same emotions that I once felt towards the girl. I was sure that I couldn't disappoint her, that I couldn't leave her, but deep down I felt that I couldn't go back to that reality. I wasn't ready to take a step back. Too much time had passed to go back down that path. And although I tried to convince myself otherwise, every time I thought about my girlfriend, I was overcome with guilt. I often thought about how it all started, about how my girlfriend and I moved in together right after she left her husband. It was like a fairy tale. They get divorced, we become a couple, and start building our lives. We made plans, talked about the future, about how we would travel, how we would arrange our home. It all seemed right and natural, but now I saw how these plans were becoming just empty words. I didn't feel that attraction, that desire that I had in the beginning. But what next? What do I do with this knowledge that my feelings have changed? Were these feelings for my coworker just a temporary fling? Or was I searching for a path to something new? I couldn't answer this question, and this feeling of uncertainty was eating me up inside. I knew that the decision I would make would affect everything: my future, my relationship with my girlfriend, my inner state. But how could I make this decision if I wasn't confident in myself? How could I understand what was really important to me? My feelings were so confused that I didn't know where the truth was and where I was just afraid of change. Every day I felt the tension growing inside me. I couldn't live in this in-between state any longer. Time was up, but what would my next role be? At some point, I realized that I had stopped looking for answers in what was happening around me. I started looking inside myself, trying to figure out what was causing my growing dissatisfaction. But the deeper I dug, the harder it became to separate my true desires from the obsessive thoughts that were firmly stuck in my head. The colleague I was texting was increasingly becoming the center of my attention, but even she was not what I was looking for. I didn't know what exactly I needed, but I felt that all of this was not just a coincidence. Everything was connected. One evening, sitting in the dark kitchen and remembering another letter from a colleague, I realized that everything I was doing now was an attempt to escape from reality. But what is reality to me? Looking at the girl who was peacefully preparing dinner in the kitchen, I felt the fog of my thoughts gradually dissipate. There was no tension in her eyes that I now often felt in myself. She was still the same caring, eager to please person, but for some reason, this no longer satisfied me. I sat down at the table and my heart sank. Every moment, every sensation of being here and not somewhere else felt like part of some doomed scenario. I tried to force myself to feel joy, to feel satisfaction in this moment. My girlfriend and I together in our apartment, cooking dinner together, planning something for the future. But this image was so far from what I expected from a relationship. I still didn't feel what had once been natural, the desire to be close, to be with her, to build something important. I sighed and decided not to hide my feelings. This might be my last chance to find a solution that would bring me clarity. It was hard for me, but I knew I couldn't continue to live as if everything was fine when there was a constant conflict going on inside me. I had to figure out what I was feeling. The girl and I were sitting at the table, and I started a conversation carefully, not knowing what would come out of it. I didn't know how to properly explain to her what had been accumulating in my thoughts for a long time. I just started talking about how everything wasn't the same as before, that I didn't feel happy. She tried to understand me as always, and it was strange. There was no shock or anger in her eyes. Rather, there was some kind of despair, as if she already knew everything, but couldn't change it. At that moment, it became difficult for me. I didn't want to hurt her, but I didn't know how to be honest without breaking her. My words were unclear, but she continued to sit next to me, and I knew that her heart was hurting too. I tried to explain that I couldn't continue in this state, that our relationship no longer satisfied me, that I couldn't remain in this inaction. I didn't know if she could understand that I wasn't blaming her, that it wasn't her fault. But for me, it was so difficult that I couldn't help but think that I was hurting the person I had been with for so long. The conversation process lasted a long time, but I understood that her reactions were also part of what I needed to hear. I didn't know how she would feel, but I continued anyway. When she was silent, I felt my body tense up, everything inside me tighten. I didn't know what would happen next, but I couldn't hide what was bothering me any longer. Every question she asked, every look she gave me was heavy. I couldn't tell if she was ready for this conversation. Maybe she felt the same way I did, but didn't know how to express it. Maybe she wanted change too, but couldn't initiate it. After this whole conversation, I felt relieved and guilty at the same time. It was clear to me that I couldn't continue in this relationship unless I could change my point of view. I couldn't pretend that everything was fine when I was in chaos inside. But on the other hand, I knew that there was pain that she would experience, and that was disappointing to me. I wasn't ready to hurt her, but I knew that this couldn't continue. Now I was faced with a difficult choice. Was what I was looking for with my colleague really a solution, or was it just a temporary escape from the real problem? I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I could continue this life, this routine, or if I had to look for something new. But how do you know where the real begins, and where it's just a desire to change your life for the sake of some excitement? These questions never ceased to torment me. A few days passed after our conversation, but the feelings still didn't subside. Everything around me continued to seem normal, but I felt my life filling with a heaviness that I couldn't cope with. We continued to live under the same roof, but every night when I came home, I felt that something between us was changing. Not in the sense that we became strangers, but there was a feeling that we could no longer be who we used to be. She no longer looked at me the way she used to, with that sincere hope that I would be able to understand her, support her, and be with her in any situation. situation. We stopped talking at night, like before, when we shared everything that happened during the day. Every moment next to her became an illusion for me, as if I knew that this was the end, but did not know how to prevent it. I often sat in silence watching her. She was still caring, attentive, but every gesture and word she said reminded me that she was trying to hold on to me. I saw her doing everything she could to be perfect for me, to make me feel like I couldn't leave. It was excruciating, and perhaps she didn't realize it herself, but her attempts to please me had become more of a burden to me. I didn't want her to feel that way, but I didn't know how to explain to her that her efforts weren't having the desired effect. During this period, my thoughts increasingly returned to the colleagues with whom I corresponded. We both understood that it was not worth meeting, but the fact of correspondence itself became increasingly important to me. I realized that I was not finding what I needed in our relationship, but it was not so simple. After all, in her eyes, I saw a person who could not understand what I felt. I tried to find a solution, but I could not find it. I kept coming back to the idea that maybe I should just leave. It seemed like a logical way out. However, despite everything that was happening, I knew that this step would be extremely painful for me. Everything we had been through was not in vain. I couldn't just forget about everything that had happened between us. But on the other hand, I felt that if I stayed, I would continue to mark time. I would repeat the same mistakes I had already made, and nothing would change. It was a difficult decision to make because I knew it would affect not only me, but her as well. Maybe even more than me. She deserved someone who could truly love her, and I wasn't that person. At some point, I realized that despite my best efforts, I couldn't be the one to make her happy, and that was both liberating and hard. I knew I couldn't continue a life where I was staying out of guilt and not truly for love. The next morning, after another night of brooding, I decided we needed to talk. I couldn't hide my true feelings from her any longer. I knew it would probably be very painful, but if I didn't, I'd be living a lie. I didn't want her to stay with me out of pity or fear of losing me. It wasn't fair to her, nor was it fair to me. She was sitting on the couch engrossed in something on her phone when I walked up to her and sat down next to her. The seconds dragged on, and each moment felt like it was my last. I looked at her face and knew I had to say what I had been keeping hidden for so long. My words were heavy, like a stone being lifted from my chest. I told her I couldn't go on, that I needed time to figure out what I wanted from life. I added that I didn't want to hurt her, but I couldn't keep pretending everything was okay when there was a storm raging inside me. Her reaction was quiet, but I could see in her eyes the same question I was asking myself. Why? Why did this happen? That was the moment I realized I couldn't give her what she deserved. And no matter how hard I tried, I wasn't the person who could be the rock she so desperately needed. The silence between us began to stretch. She tried to say something, but the words did not come. I saw her lips trembling and realized that my actions would be painful for her, but necessary. I could not deceive myself and continue to live in a relationship that did not bring happiness to either of us. Then I made a decision. It was scary but inevitable. I knew that this step would be the end for us, but perhaps it would be the beginning of something new. The night after that conversation was hard. I couldn't sleep, couldn't shake the feeling that something inside me had broken, like a fragile vessel that could no longer hold its shape. I lay there feeling empty, trying to figure out what to do next. Everything that had come before seemed foreign, unimportant. The thought that I had to move on, that I might be on the threshold of a new life, brought me no relief. Instead, every moment was riddled with uncertainty. I knew that this night would become more and more painful with each passing hour. But at some point I realized that I could no longer pretend. I could no longer try to bring back something that had disappeared with the passage of time. The thought was liberating, but also terrifying. I was not ready to leave behind what had once seemed an integral part of my life. The morning greeted me with gray clouds and light rain. It was symbolic. My head was all in a fog. My thoughts were all mixed up, not letting me understand what I should do. I didn't know what would happen tomorrow, didn't know how I would feel in a week or a month. I wanted everything to be resolved quickly, for time to ease the pain, but I knew that wasn't how it worked. When I got home from work, she was sitting in the kitchen as usual, with a cup of coffee. We exchanged a quick glance, and all I could do was go to her. I felt her gaze, which seemed to penetrate my very soul, asking what would happen now. There was no anger or resentment in her eyes, only a silent understanding that everything was really ending. She said she wanted to talk. We sat across from each other. I didn't know what she would say. Maybe she would suggest that I stay. Try again. But her words were simple and clear, like never before. She acknowledged that our lives were no longer what they were, and it wasn't the fault of either of us. We had both changed, and maybe all we needed was to stop being afraid to change our reality. At that moment, I realized that she was also breaking free. She didn't know how to continue either, but she realized that neither of us could hold on to a relationship that had run its course. She didn't blame me, didn't try to hold on. Instead, she gave me space to make my own choices. I sat in silence, feeling the weight of her words. We both knew we had to move on, that every attempt we made to hold on was an echo of what was already gone. But in that moment, I felt like this wasn't the end. Rather, it was the beginning of something new, something that wouldn't be tied to old fears and doubts. We sat in silence for a while, breathing in this moment that, despite its heaviness, was not destructive. I felt my thoughts clearing up. I didn't know what I was going to do next, but I knew one thing. There was no point in going back to what had already happened. When it was time to leave, I looked at her, and she gave me a quiet smile, letting me know that everything would be okay. She had to find her way, just like me. We both knew that we had the strength to move forward, even if the path was difficult. I walked away, and with every step I took, it became easier. It was hard at first. Every step felt like a burden, but with every meter, it became easier. I felt the space around me open up, as if I was breathing freely for the first time. I was alone, but I didn't feel lonely. There was no pain in this new state, only emptiness, which strangely enough was liberating. Maybe I didn't know where this path would lead me, but I knew that I couldn't stay in a place where I no longer felt alive. And it was this realization that gave me the strength to move on, despite the fact that there was still a long way to go. Maybe one day I'll look back, and it won't just be a memory of what was. It will be the beginning of a new phase where I can figure out who I am and what I need. And if I'm ever ready for a relationship again, I'll know it will be on a different level. But until then, I have to walk this path alone to become the person I want to see in the mirror. As I closed the door behind me, I felt the world around me begin to change. I didn't know where this path would lead, but perhaps that was its power.